Let's look at what Trita Parsi had to say to Drop Site News. Trump snatched defeat from the jaws of success. Dr. Trita Parsi, Iran expert at Quincy Institute, friend of the show, told Dropsite that Trump squandered a ceasefire that disproportionately favored the United States. Trump really snatched defeat from the jaws of success because the ceasefire actually disproportionately favored the United States, Parsi said. Without resuming the war, Trump could have alleviated pressure on global energy markets, eroded Iranian leverage, and drawn out a negotiating process without immediately lifting sanctions, one of Tehran's core demands. Instead, he escalated. The more aggressive Trump's rhetoric tends to become, the more he says that Iranians are in disarray, the more it tends to be a reflection of the fact that his own negotiating position has become tremendously vulnerable and weakened, Parsi said. This is also true. Parsi said that Trump has also appeared to embrace the faulty FDD projections including those produced by the neoconservative think tank Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is, again, an Israeli cutout, just so you understand. Initially started as under the name Emet, Hebrew for Truth, in 2001. Its stated purpose for Foundation for Defending Democracy was to defend Israel's interest in America, okay, to launder Israel's reputation in America. FDD is a reflection of whatever the Israeli goals are, okay? And they are inside of the administration. It's Benjamin Netanyahu's own personal think tank, and they have FDD guys that are in the negotiations rooms now. As this past week, Donald Trump hired someone from FDD to sit next to Witkoff and Jared Kushner. So it's totally ridiculous. But yeah, FDD, in the interest of advancing Israel's goals here, is going to sully any kind of negotiation process that might be implemented and continue feeding bad information to the United States of America. And we all know how that fucking worked so far. FDD has convinced Trump that his naval blockade would bring a weakened and more pliable Iran to the negotiating table. Trump began claiming that Iranian oil infrastructure was on the verge of catastrophic failure. On what Trump is actually seeking, Parsi said, I think Trump is looking for some sort of spectacular military action that is not necessarily successful on a strategic level, but on a tactical level gives the impression that he has dominance, escalation dominance, and control, and then go to the negotiating table and strike a deal. The Iranians are not going to allow him to get that. It may actually prove to be a blessing for the Iranians if Trump resumes military attacks, Parsi said. Iran still has escalation dominance in this scenario. On the contrary, I think the Iranians have now further honed their strategy. They are more confident about exactly what they can achieve, Parsi said. Iran would likely expand attacks in the Gulf, particularly targeting the UAE, Israel's closest Arab ally. The report was published just before the U.S. attacks on Fujairah, UAE, were confirmed later in the day on Monday. On Trump's China visit scheduled for May 14th, Parsi said, economic pressure is the only news that seems to impact the White House. The only thing that reaches him is how bad the economy is going. It used to be markets and munitions, and now it's markets, munitions, and midterms, right? Like domestic pressure coming from the Republican Party's future, domestic pressure that impacts Trump's popularity, domestic pressure that is increasing as a consequence of prices for the average American consumer at the gas pumps skyrocketing, right? The only thing that reaches him is how bad the economy is going and how much of a problem it's going to be for him if he has to show up in Beijing and face the Chinese from this utter position of embarrassment and weakness. He still has this false illusion that the blockade, one way or another, is going to deliver him the type of victory that will rewrite the entire history of these last 7 to 8 weeks. If he goes after Iran's exports to China, he will not only escalate this regional conflict into a global conflict, but he will further push up oil prices, which will backfire faster on him than it will backfire on the Iranians. On Iran's emerging toll system, Parsi said that while some countries may balk at the idea of paying tolls to Iran, eventually they would accept this as a new norm. At the end of the day, they need their oil and they will pay the fees. And the Iranians are going to use the fee collections, not necessarily as something that replaces all income, but something that forces countries to reestablish financial connections with Iran, countries that otherwise had left the Iranian markets as a result of U.S. sanctions, he said. Now the Iranians have leverage to push them back in, and that is of tremendous value to them to be able to make sure that they have these connections. This is precisely the reason why I said from the start, America's interest, stated by Marco Rubio, was to apply pressure to Iran. That wasn't to actually have their military assets in the region, because America has maximum military leverage, right, in comparison to the European allies. What the fuck is one like nuclear aircraft carrier from France going to do? That Americans can't. America has 11 that they can use against Iran if they choose to do so, right? The real reason why they wanted European partners to engage Iran militarily was not for the military pressure, but more so for the diplomatic pressure. Because Iran is, by way of the toll system, forcing bilateral commitments with EU partners. Okay? Iran wants to be a sovereign state that is a normal country that can have normal commerce with these international, with the rest of the markets, even if they can't do it with the United States of America, because that was one of the big problems with the sanctions regime, was that all of these other countries, worried about secondary sanctions that they might receive from the United States of America, stopped trading with Iran. Okay? And Iran is successfully implementing these bilateral commitments right now with all of these other countries, including with France. The plan was simple. The UAE exits OPEC, breaks free from its limits, and ramps up production. 2 days later, America announces Operation Freedom and forces open the Strait of Hormuz. Emirati oil floods the market, prices crash, and Iran loses its only powerful card in negotiations. Iran sent a strong, clear message today. You want cheap oil? You won't get it unless you return to negotiations and provide guarantees to implement our demands that you agreed to discuss. By successfully foiling their plan, Iran will return to negotiations from a stronger position than before, and it will prove to the world that it controls the Hormuz, and whoever controls the Hormuz controls the oil, and whoever controls the oil controls the world. Okay, this is a little bit aggressive, but yeah. Thoughts on China telling firms to ignore sanctions? It makes total sense. Obviously, China has been ignoring the sanctions. Why the fuck would they not say this publicly? Trump is repeatedly overplaying his hand on Iran and America's strategic detriment. China is now telling firms to ignore new U.S. sanctions on Iranian oil. Per Bloomberg, this signals a far more aggressive stance from China and risks pulling global banks into a U.S.-China standoff. You don't want to have this conversation because Donald Trump did not successfully decouple the rest of the world from China. That was the goal of the Liberation Day tariffs, if you recall. But that failed. Okay? That fucking failed. America had to buckle under the pressure. And therefore, America does not have the capacity to force other countries to no longer trade with China. China is still the manufacturing hub of the planet. Explainer why China decided this time to directly resist latest U.S. sanctions. Trump in his eternal wisdom all but forced them to. Huge news in China today since Besant actually sanctioned larger entities this time. Hengli is a huge deal. China is entirely willing to fight economic war over this from what I can see. I will now talk about why Hengli is a big deal and why the Trump admin stepped over the line. This was China invoking the blocking statute for the first time. China's Ministry of Commerce has for the first time activated its 2021 blocking rules, ordering all Chinese firms and individuals not to comply with U.S. sanctions targeting 5 independent Chinese oil refineries accused of purchasing Iranian crude. This leaves only one option for the United States of America. Either the United States of America now will forcibly overtake Iranian oil tankers that are slated to arrive at Chinese oil refineries, or they just have to back away from it. America, that has had a terrible time so far trying to militarily dominate Iran, a much smaller country than China, now has to go up against the manufacturing base of the entire planet. It's not going to happen unless they're fucking insane. And, you know, the reasonable option here is to back the fuck away. But also, the reasonable option has always been to also negotiate with Iran. The reasonable option was to never bomb Iran. But America never takes the reasonable option. So I don't know. Like the logical steps to take here is not to add a secondary blockade, which America did. The logical step here would be to de-escalate. Okay?